Welcome to Off the Gryd podcast. Today's topic we're going to be talking about is QA and building BCBA buy-in. We always see BCBAs viewing quality assurance as the enemy, and this comes up a lot when ABA organizations struggle to build their quality assurance system but get resistance from the BCBAs. So the question is today, how do we get BCBAs to buy into quality assurance? Now let's talk about the reality. Quality assurance can be one of the most valuable systems in an ABA organization, but only if it's implemented in the right way. When BCBAs are feeling that quality assurance is being done to them instead of with them, it quickly becomes frustrating for them, burdensome, and disconnected from the clinical work that they're trying to do. Today, we're going to talk about how to introduce quality assurance in a way that supports BCBAs, respects their clinical expertise, and creates a system that strengthens quality rather than simply adding something else to their plate. Let's start with the first step. Let's understand the concern. When a BCBA resists quality assurance, it's easy to assume that they're being defensive or resistant to change. But more than that, their concerns are really valid. They're not usually opposed to quality. They're just reacting to a process that makes them feel unclear, unrealistic, or disconnected from their day-to-day clinical responsibilities. Now, one of the biggest concerns is time. A BCBA may think, I'm already managing a full caseload, I'm supervising RBTs, I'm writing treatment plans, I'm communicating with families, I'm handling authorizations and scheduling, I'm making clinical decisions. Now you also want me to do quality assurance? It just feels like another responsibility. And if QA is introduced as another stream of connections, emails, reminders, phone call, documentation requests, then that concern is really understandable to them. Rather than responding with, this is just something everyone has to do, a better way to respond is, the purpose of quality assurance isn't to create more work, it's to reduce unnecessary work. Now, unnecessary work can come from when quality assurance documentation is not up to par, they're going to have more work. Now, another concern that we often see is clinical autonomy. Someone is coming in and recognizing that they're not working on particular goals and they need to work on something else, or giving them advice that those goals aren't related to something that insurance funders will approve. And they feel like someone who doesn't know the client is reviewing their treatment plans, their documentation, and making comments that don't reflect the clinical picture. Now, understandably, that is a valid concern. And that's why the purpose of QA needs to be communicated clearly. Quality assurance should never replace clinical expertise. That's not our intention. It's a role to ensure that clinical decisions are documented clearly, supported appropriately, and aligned to those regulatory and organizational expectations. That's all we're trying to do. Now, one way to explain that is QA isn't here to decide what clinical recommendations should be. It's here to make sure your clinical reasoning is clearly documented and audit ready. And that distinction is important. So, for example, a QA reviewer isn't deciding whether a goal is clinically appropriate. Instead, they may identify that a goal isn't measurable, the baseline information is missing, maybe it doesn't warrant clinical intervention, progress summary doesn't clearly support the recommendation. It's not taking away the BCBA's clinical judgment. It's really helping to ensure that their clinical reasoning is communicated in a way that can be understood, defended, and supported during an insurance review. Now, another concern is that BCBAs may feel that quality assurance is taking away their leadership. Now, this often happens when QA feedback is delivered directly to the RBTs without involving the BCBA. From the BCBA's perspective, it feels like this is my client, it's my case, it's my technician. If someone's providing feedback, I should know what's being said. And that is a fair concern. If quality assurance is reviewing RBT session notes, the BCBA should be part of that process. They don't need to be copied on every minor correction, but there should be a clear process for when they are notified. So, for example, if an RBT has recurring documentation errors, maybe a clinical concern that they're not adding properly to their notes, a misalignment between the treatment plan, what's written, and the day-to-day session notes, what the RBTs are documenting, or another pattern that could affect service quality, the BCBA should be looped into the correspondence. And that allows them to supervise effectively while maintaining ownership of the clinical quality of their cases. Now, another concern is that some BCBAs may feel that their current process is already working. They may tell you, I already review my notes. I already train my RBTs. I already review my treatment plans. I already know my cases. And they may be right. Now, the purpose of QA isn't to suggest that they're not doing their job, it's to establish a consistent standard across the organization. Now, a helpful response might be, well, many of our BCBAs already have strong systems in place, and quality assurance isn't being implemented because people are failing. It's being implemented so that every client record is held to the same standard, regardless of who provides the service. And that distinction matters. Quality assurance shouldn't be introduced as a punishment or a way to monitor performance. It should be presented as part of the organizational's infrastructure for supporting quality and consistency. So, how do we actually build that buy in? Now, the first strategy would be to involve the BCBAs before the QA process is finalized. Now, instead of designing the entire process and then announcing it, bring BCBAs into the conversation early on. Ask questions like, what documentation challenges are you seeing? Where do you find RBT struggling the most? Which parts of the quality assurance would be most helpful? And what concerns you about the process? Not only does that give BCBAs a voice, but it also helps leadership and it builds a system that's practical and realistic. Now, that's not to say that we're going to allow the BCBAs to decide what needs to be done. Because they will be involved with the process, if you ask them, that will also help the quality assurance succeed. Now, the second strategy would be to clearly communicate the purpose of QA. If the only message that the BCBAs are hearing is we're reviewing documentation because insurance requires it, quality assurance can feel purely administrative. Instead, connect it to clinical quality. Quality assurance helps ensure documentation accurately reflects the services provided, demonstrates medical necessity, supports measurable treatment goals. Ultimately, it protects the client, the provider, and the organization. When QA is framed as a tool that strengthens ethical, high-quality care, not just compliance, BCBAs are more likely to see its value. Now, the third strategy is to define the roles clearly. Now, one of the biggest concerns QA creates tension is that people don't know who owns what. So, for example, a QA reviewer may be responsible for identifying documentation concerns, the BCBA may be responsible for clinical follow-up, and the RBT for making the corrections, and the supervisor or clinical director for addressing recurring or significant issues. Now, when those responsibilities aren't clearly defined, people tend to feel blamed. When they are, the process feels collaborative and structured. Now, not every QA finding requires the same level of response. A typo, a missing location, a formatting issue may only require a simple correction. On the other hand, recurring documentation concerns, vague intervention descriptions, copied content, or discrepancies between the session note and the treatment plan may warrant BCBA involvement. So you want to separate those minor corrections from clinical concerns in order to allow the BCBAs to differentiate what they need to do versus what quality assurance needs to do. And that tiered system of QA will be valuable. The categorization finding as low level, moderate, critical, BCBAs aren't going to be overwhelmed with every minor issue, but they're only notified when there's a pattern or clinical risks that require their attention. Now, the fifth strategy is to create a feedback loop. Quality assurance is not a one-way process. BCBAs should have opportunities to provide feedback as well. So if a QA reviewer may flag something that's clinically appropriate but wasn't understood, a template may need a revision. Expectations may need clarification, or the review criteria may benefit from additional examples. And that ongoing dialogue strengthens QA over time and reinforces an important message. We're not just reviewing your work, we're building the system together. So when things are subjective or there's areas that BCBAs can provide feedback, it's just a great opportunity to include them. Now let's talk about what not to do. Don't introduce QA by saying insurance is cracking down, so now everyone needs to be checked. That just creates panic, and while it may reflect today's current environment, leading with fear is unlikely to build trust. Don't make QA feel like a gotcha system. If a BCBA believes QA exists primarily to catch mistakes or report them to leadership, they'll naturally become more defensive instead of collaborative. Now, also don't bypass the BCBA when the concern is clinical. If an RBT consistently submits weak documentation, vague intervention descriptions, or notes that don't align with the treatment plan, the BCBA should be involved. Supporting documentation quality is part of effective supervision, and the BCBAs have the power to do that. And don't create expectations that aren't realistic. If BCBAs are expected to respond to every QA request within 24 hours while managing large caseloads, the process is likely to fail because it isn't designed around real clinical workloads. And finally, don't expect a single training to create buy-in. Buy-in develops through clear communication, consistent processes, and follow-through over time. So what might be a practical workflow? Step 1, before launching QA, meet with the BCBA team. Explain that purpose, review criteria, the overall process, clarify what QA will and won't be responsible for, and invite feedback before implementation. Next, establish clear review criteria. BCBAs should know exactly what is being evaluated, whether that's objective data, connection to treatment goals, interventions used, client response, caregiver involvement, supervision documentation, or medical necessity language. Making those expectations will create that clear transparency. Then define notification thresholds. BCBAs don't need to be notified about every single minor correction. They need to be informed about when those patterns happen. Then create a clear follow-up process. Everyone should know who follows up with the RBT, when the BCBA becomes involved, and when concerns escalate to the clinical director. Then share those trends, not just mistakes. Instead of only reaching out when something's actually wrong, provide regular updates on organization-wide QA trends. So for example, you may want to say, this month the most common documentation issue was vague intervention descriptions, or we saw a significant improvement in caregiver training documentation after last month's training. Sharing those trends reinforce that QA is about continuous quality improvement and not just correcting individual mistakes. You also want to celebrate improvement. When RBT responds well to feedback, recognize the progress. If a treatment plan is particularly strong, use that as a model for others. Positive reinforcement is not just important in QA as a clinical practice, is one of the fastest ways to build lasting buy-in. Now let's talk about language you can use when speaking with BCBAs. If a BCBA says it's going to take too much time, you can respond by, I completely understand that concern. The purpose of QA isn't to add unnecessary work. It's to catch patterns early, reduce repeated corrections, prevent last-minute issues, and make expectations clearer for the entire team. A well-designed QA system helps identify problems before they become bigger issues. So instead of constantly putting out fires, BCBAs should feel like they have a system that helps prevent those fires in the first place. If a BCBA is going to say, QA doesn't know my client, you can say, you're right. The QA isn't replacing your clinical judgment. Your clinical expertise remains central. Our role is to ensure documentation clearly reflects your clinical reasoning and meets organization and payer expectations. If a BCBA says, I already have my own system, you can say, that's great, and we want to build on what's already working. QA helps ensure that every client record is held to the same organizational standard while still allowing each BCBA to exercise their own clinical expertise. Now, if a BCBA says, why is QA giving feedback to my RBT? You can say, we want RBTs to receive timely documentation feedback, but you should always be involved when there's reoccurring concerns, clinical issues, or patterns that require supervision. The goal is to strengthen your oversight and not bypass it. And if a BCBA says, this feels like you're micromanaging, you can respond with, I understand why you might feel this way. QA shouldn't feel like micromanagement. It should feel like a support system. So if the process starts to feel too burdensome, that's a signal that we should revisit the workflow and make sure we're only escalating the concerns that truly require attention. The key message is QA buy-in doesn't happen because leadership says it's important. It happens when BCBAs understand the purpose, trust the process, and know that their clinical expertise is respected. A strong QA system should answer 3 questions. How does this help my client? How does this support my supervision? How does this make documentation expectations clearer for my team? When BCBAs can answer those questions, QA becomes less of a burden and more of a resource. So as you build your QA process, don't just ask, what are we reviewing? Also ask, what are we communicating? How are we communicating the process? Who needs to be involved? Which concerns require BCBA follow-up? How can QE support the clinical team instead of creating unnecessary tension? Because the goal isn't simply audit-ready documentation. The goal is a system where quality, compliance, and clinical care work together. And that's how you move QA from correction to collaboration. Thanks for listening to Off the Grid. We'll see you next time.